doer or the receiver of the action. They are classified as two, active and passive. In short, you just have to remember that in order to identify the voice of the verb, you need to look for the subject and take note of the role of the subject, whether it is the doer or the receiver of the action. That will tell you whether the voice of the verb is active or passive. Now let's take a closer look on the difference between an active voice of the verb and a passive voice of the verb. When we say active voice of the verb, the subject is the doer of the action. The subject is the one performing and actually doing the action or the verb. And if it's passive voice of the verb, the subject is just the receiver of the action. It's not directly stated that the subject did or performed the action. Again, if it's active, the subject is the doer. If it's passive, the subject is the receiver of the action. Now, what is the subject of a sentence? I hope you still remember it from your previous lessons during elementary, but we'll just have a quick review of what subject is. A subject is a part of a sentence that contains the person or thing performing the action or the verb. When I say action, that's the verb. In a sentence, again, take note, the subject is the person or thing performing the action in a sentence. But not all the time. What do I mean by not all the time? In passive voices, the subject is not the one performing the action, but the one receiving the action. That's what I mentioned earlier. So once again, the subject is the one who does the action or the one who receives the action. But in a sentence, the subject is the one being talked about in the sentence. Okay, just take note of that. The subject is the one being talked about. Now, take note that a subject is a noun or a pronoun. Earlier, I mentioned person and thing. But to be more exact and to be more detailed, we have to remember that subject of a sentence refers to the noun or the pronoun. When we say noun, they are the person, place, thing, animal, event, or ideas in a sentence. That's noun. And when we say pronoun, they are I, you, we, he, she, it, they, etc. There are a lot of pronouns. Again, take note that a subject is a noun or pronoun. Now, how do we easily identify if a sentence is in active or passive voice? Students, I need you to listen carefully to this because this is quite confusing. First, you need to look for the subject and the predicate. Remember that a predicate contains the verb and verb is an action word. That's the first step. Look for the subject and the predicate. Again, the predicate contains the verb. The predicate is the part of a sentence or a clause in the sentence that contains the verb. Take note that most of the time the subject comes before the predicate, so not all the time. It's just usually that the subject comes before the predicate. Second step, you have to identify if the subject is the doer or receiver of the action. Again, if the subject is the doer of the action, it's active voice. And if the subject is the receiver of the verb, it's passive voice. So remember that if it's the receiver, it's not the one performing. It's not the one doing the action. Now, let's take a look on the example over here. We have Frank will clean the house every day. According to the first step, we have to identify the subject and the predicate first. Now, let's look for the predicate first. The predicate is will clean the house every day. How did we identify that that's the predicate? Because it contains the verb will clean. Students, it's not just clean, but will clean. That's the complete verb. So we have already identified the verb and the predicate. So let's look for the subject. Well, obviously, the subject is Frank. Again, the subject is Frank, the verb is will clean, and the predicate is will clean the house every day. That's the complete clause. Now, the question is the subject the doer or receiver of the action? Is Frank the one who will perform the action will clean? The answer is yes. Frank is the subject is the doer of the action, and therefore this sentence is in active voice of the verb. I hope you understood that part. Okay, let's have another example. The house will be cleaned by Frank every day. First step, we have to identify the subject and the predicate. The predicate in this sentence is will be cleaned by Frank every day. And how did we identify that that's the predicate? Because it contains the verb will be cleaned. Okay, that's the complete verb. Not only cleaned, but will be cleaned. What, teacher, what is will be? Why is it a verb? We call will be as an auxiliary verb. Later on, I'm going to discuss more about an auxiliary verb. Just take note that that's the complete verb and not only cleaned. Alright, we are done identifying the predicate and the verb. Now, which one is the subject in the sentence? The subject is house or the house. Again, subject house, verb will be cleaned, and the predicate is will be cleaned by Frank every day. So the question is the subject the doer or receiver of the action? Is house the one who will clean, or is house the one that will be cleaned? So if the house is the one that will be cleaned, then the answer to this question is that the house is the receiver of the action. Why? Because the house is not going to perform the action cleaning, right? The house is the one receiving the action cleaning because the house is the one that will be cleaned. Okay, I hope that's clear. So again, the subject is house, and that's the receiver of the action. So if that's the receiver of the action, then the sentence is in passive voice of the verb. There are sentences in passive voice of the verb that do not use the preposition by to introduce the doer of the action. And in your module, it was stated there that sentences in passive voice of the verb uses the preposition by, and that's correct. But take note, it's just usually, so not all the time. Now, how are you going to identify a sentence that is actually in passive voice if there is no preposition by? Now, let's look at this example. The paper was thrown in the bin. Let's follow the two steps I mentioned earlier. First, you have to identify the subject, the verb. And the verb is was thrown. Next, identify the subject. The subject is paper. Now ask yourself, is the paper the one doing or receiving the action? Is the paper the one to be thrown, or will the paper throw? So the answer is that the paper is the one that will be thrown. In short, the paper is the receiver of the action. Paper is not the one doing the action or performing the action of throwing. So if the subject is the receiver, then it is in passive voice of the verb. And look at the example sentence. So there is no by, but it's clearly stated that the subject is the receiver. So if the subject is the receiver, it's in passive voice of the verb. Another example. The thief was caught near the park. Let's identify the verb. The verb is was caught. The subject is thief. Now ask yourself again, is thief the receiver or the doer of the action? So definitely thief is not the one who did the action of catching, but thief is the one who was caught. Okay, so subject is the receiver, and definitely it's in passive voice of the verb. Why is thief the receiver of the action? Because it's not stated in the sentence as to who actually does the action. There's no doer, okay? Because there's no by phrase. The by is the one to introduce the doer of the action. But there's not, it's not stated in this sentence. What's stated only is the receiver, which is the subject, and the verb or the predicate, okay? I hope that's clear. Just think if the subject is receiver or the doer of the action. That will tell you whether it is active or passive voice of the verb. I hope everything is clear to you now. I hope you understood how to differentiate or how to identify a sentence in active and passive voice of the verb. Now let's try this one. You're going to identify if the sentences are in active or passive voices of the verb. Let's have number 1. The lamp was smashed. Again, follow the steps I mentioned. Identify the verb and the subject. So in this number, the verb is was smashed and the subject is lamp. Now, ask yourself, is lamp the doer or receiver of the action? Okay, so the answer for number 1 is passive. Why passive? Because lamp is the one that received the action was smashed. It's not that lamp did the action of smashing, right? The lamp cannot perform any action, but it can receive the action. Next, number 2. Sandy baked a cake for her mother. Again, identify the verb. The verb is baked. The subject is Sandy. Is Sandy the receiver or doer of the action? The answer for number 2 is active. Why active? Because Sandy is the one who did the action of baking. Sandy is not the one who was baked, but Sandy did the baking of a cake. So it's active. Next, number 3. He had returned to Philippines from Korea. The verb is had returned. Not only returned, but had returned. And the subject is he. Now, is he the doer or receiver of the action? The answer is active. Why is this active? Because the pronoun or subject he is the one who did the action of returning to Philippines from Korea. Okay? It's not that he is the one who received, but he is the one who did or performed the action. Next, number 4. The tree house was built by my father. The verb is was built. The subject, tree house. Now, is tree house the receiver or the doer of the action? The answer is passive because treehouse is not the doer. The treehouse cannot do anything, but the treehouse received the action of was built because the treehouse was the one built, not the one building. Okay, so it's passive. Next, number 5. The children will be visiting tomorrow. Which is the verb in the sentence? The verb is will be visiting. Not only visiting, but will be visiting. And the subject is children. Now, is children the receiver or doer of the action? The answer is active. Why active? Because children is the one who will do the action of visiting. It's not that the children will be the one to be visited, but children will be the one performing the action of visiting. So it's active. Okay, I hope that's clear. How do we transform active voice to passive voice and vice versa? Listen carefully. Again, this is very confusing, so I hope you understand this. In transforming a verb from active to passive or vice versa, take note of the tense of the verb. If the verb in active voice is in present tense, the passive voice should also be in present tense passive voice and vice versa. Now, however, the form of the verb as to S or simple forms vary depending on the number of the subjects. Later, I'm going to show you about singular and plural forms of the voices of the verb. In passive voice, the main verb is usually introduced by an auxiliary verb. This is what I'm talking about earlier. Students, you have to familiarize yourself with main verbs and auxiliary verbs. Now, when we talk about main verbs, they are the head verbs, okay? They are the head verbs, or in short, the action words themselves. When we see action words, the words that can be performed or can be done, like for example, eat, run, drink, cook, etc. Those are verbs that you can actually perform. Now, auxiliary verbs are helping verbs added to the main verb. Auxiliary verbs are added before the main verb. Okay? Why are they auxiliary? Because they are helping the main verbs. Examples are be, is, are, was, were, has, have, had, been, being, etc. Later on, I'm going to show you a table for that. Now, in passive voice, the main verb is usually introduced by an auxiliary verb. Why introduced? Meaning to say the possession, again, the possession of the auxiliary verb is before the main verb. When adding auxiliary verb, the main verb changes from simple tense to past participle. I know you are getting confused, but I'm going to show you an example later on. Again, just remember auxiliary verb plus past participle of the verb. Okay? Now, this is the example. For example, in active voice of the verb is eats. This is an example of a main verb because it's an action word. You can actually perform eat. You can eat. You can do that action. Now, how do we process the auxiliary in the main verb? Again, the auxiliary verb comes before the main verb. Now, why did we use has? We use has because the verb eats is in singular form. It's only one. Has means singular. Okay? Has plus the main verb in past participle, which is eaten. Take note of the change from eats to eaten. The past participle of eat is eaten. So has plus eaten is seen in the passive voice of the verb has eaten. Okay? I hope you have seen the shifting of the main verb into the past participle and the adding of the auxiliary verb and the past participle. Again, from eats in the active voice, we process it. Has plus past participle eaten equals has eaten in the passive voice. So this is what I'm talking about, the table of auxiliary verbs. We have here auxiliary verbs to be added before the main verb in converting active voice to passive voice. Take note, from active to passive. So these are auxiliary verbs to be used in forming passive voices of the verb in a sentence. You have to follow the rule, auxiliary verb plus past participle form of the main verb. So we have two sets here. These are all simple tenses, and this part is for perfect tenses. Let's have first the simple present tense. When we say singular, that's only one. And when we say plural, that's more than one. So that's a lot. It could be two or more. Now, what do we mean by singular present tense? We use we use the auxiliary verb is if it's a singular present tense. Let's say, for example, the bicycle is broken. The action, the subject in the sentence, the bicycle is broken, is bicycle, and bicycle is only one. So the subject is singular. So we're going to use is because bicycle is only one. Now, what if there are a lot of bicycles? Then we're going to use are. The bicycles are broken. See the difference? The bicycle is broken. The bicycles are broken. And broken is the past participle of the main verb break. Okay, we did not say is break. The bicycle is break. That's wrong. We did not say the bicycles are break. That's also wrong. We have to use the past participle. Now, in present perfect tense, we are using has been for singular subjects and have been for plural subjects. Now, as you can see here on the perfect tenses, there is always the word been. So you're going to use the word been, or you're going to add that auxiliary verb when you are forming passive voices of the verb in a sentence. Now, let's have an example sentence for has been. The bicycle has been broken. The bicycles have been broken. That's just it. It's very simple. Next, singular past tense. The past tense of is was. So, for example, the bicycle was broken yesterday. So, we could say that as an example. The bicycle was broken yesterday because the action happened yesterday. So, it's past tense. Or we could say, if it's plural, we could say, the bicycles were broken yesterday. Okay? It's just easy. You have to, you can see the tense of the verb in the given sentence. If it's active, you can find it there, whether the tense of the verb is past, present, or future. Okay, past perfect tense, we're going to use had been. Whether it's singular or plural, whether the subject is one or more than one, you will use had been. The bicycle had been broken yesterday. The bicycles had been broken yesterday. So it's just the same. Next, for singular future tense, we're going to use will be, shall be. And if it's plural future tense, it's just the same. Will be, shall be. Let's say, for example, the children will be invited to the program. Children is more than one, that's plural. So we used will be. The children will be invited to the program. Or if it's singular, the child will be invited to the party. So it's just the same, whether it's singular or plural. For future perfect tense, you just have to add have been. Okay, it's the same whether it's singular or plural subject. You're going to add have been, will have been, or shall have been. The children shall have been invited to the program. The child shall have been invited to the party. So it's just the same. Okay, I hope that's clear. You can take a look back at this whenever you're converting or transforming sentences from active to passive voice of the verb. Now, let's look at another complex part of this lesson. Let's look at the tenses of the verb, starting with the simple present tense. I have here an example sentence for active voice. Number 1, Mom cooks my breakfast. Again, let's identify the verb, the subject. Okay, so the subject here is mom, the verb is cooks, and the receiver of the action cooks is breakfast, my breakfast, because it's in active voice because mom is the one doing the action, cooks, and breakfast is the one being cooked. So it's the receiver. Now, how do we make it in passive voice? Look at the example. In order to make an active voice, a sentence in active voice to passive voice, you have to make the receiver as the subject. So the receiver will come first in the sentence. My breakfast, and then look at the shift of the form. Here, look at the change in the form of the verb. From a simple present tense, cooks. This is also simple present tense, but it's in passive. Just like what I have shown you, you have to add an auxiliary verb in forming a passive voice. Okay, so the auxiliary verb is because the subject breakfast is singular. Okay, my breakfast is cooked. From cooks, it became cooked because cooked is the past participle of cooks. Okay, I hope you got it. And then by mom. So the by preposition here introduces the doer of the action, mom. Okay, mom is the doer of the action in this sentence. And in this sentence, mom is also the doer of the action. What just changed is that the role of the subject. Because in this sentence, the subject is mom. She's the doer. But in this sentence, the subject is my breakfast, and that's the receiver of the action. Okay? Next, what if the sentence is in passive voice and you're going to convert it to active voice? Let's have this example. The cars are bumped by the truck. The subject is the cars. The verb is are bumped. Okay, look at the verb. It also has an auxiliary verb because again, it's in passive voice. If it's passive voice, there is always an auxiliary verb. Okay, and the truck is the doer of the action. How are we going to transfer it or to convert it into active voice? Same thing with this. The subject will be, look, the receiver of the action. The verb will change from the one with auxiliary to a simple present tense. This is present because it's are, it's not were. Okay? And then the doer of the action will become the subject in the active voice. Okay, I hope that's clear. Again, if it's active voice, the subject becomes the doer in passive voice. And then the verb changes from a simple tense with the one with auxiliary. And then the receiver will become the doer in the passive voice. Okay? Same thing with passive voice here. The cars, the subject, will become the receiver in active voice. The verb will change from the one with auxiliary to a simple present tense, and then the doer will become the subject in the sentence. That's for active and that's for passive. Next, let's talk about the simple past tense. I have here an example sentence for active voice. We have number 1, Carla threw the trash. The subject is Carla, verb is threw, and the trash is the receiver. Because Carla is the one throwing. Carla is the one who did the action threw. It's past tense. It already happened. And how are we going to convert it to passive voice? Look at this example. Carla will become the doer in the passive voice. And then the verb in past tense will become a past tense with auxiliary verb too. Since this is past tense, then the auxiliary verb has to be in past tense also, was. Why did we use was? Because the subject is singular. Okay? And then from through past tense to the past participle thrown. Okay, I hope you got that one. Next, what if the sentence is in passive and we're going to convert it to active? Look at this example. They were invited to the party by Megan. Okay, the subject is they, and the verb is were invited. The doer of the action is Megan, because Megan is the one who invited them. Okay, now how are we going to make it into active voice? Look at this example. The subject will now become the receiver. The verb, the one with auxiliary, will now become a simple past tense, no auxiliary. And then Megan, the doer here, will become the subject, which is also the doer in the active voice. So the role of Megan did not change. She is still the doer. It's just that she became the subject here. Okay? So look at this part. In here, the subject is they. But when we transferred it to active, it becomes them. Because that's how you shift it. You cannot say Megan invited they to the party. That's wrong. The object part or the objective pronoun of they is them. Okay, they is for subject only. That's used for subjects of the sentence. But them is used for the object of the sentence. Because as you can see, them is not the subject here, but it is the object. Next, let's have the simple future tense. I have here one example for active voice. Alex will drive the car. The subject is Alex, the verb is will drive, and the receiver is car. Why is the car the receiver? Because car cannot definitely do the driving. Now, how do we transform it to passive voice? Look at this example. Alex, who is the doer and the subject in the active voice, will become the doer here. Okay? And then the verb will drive, which is in future tense, will become will be driven here. We added this this auxiliary verb be, and then the drive, which is the main verb, is transformed into past participle driven. Then car, the receiver, becomes the subject here. Okay, it's just a shifting. The subject and the receiver exchanges position. Next, passive voice. We have the books will be replaced by the librarian. The subject is books, the verb is will be replaced, and the doer of the action is the librarian, because librarian is the one who will do the replacing of the books. Now, how do we transform it into active? Just again, change the position of the doer and the subject. The doer will become the subject here in the active voice of the verb. So it's the first thing to appear. And then the verb will be replaced, will now become will replace only. No more be, okay? And then the books, which is the subject, will now become the receiver here in active voice of the verb. Okay, let's now talk about the present perfect tense. I have here an example sentence for active voice. In present perfect tense, number 1, Felix has started to write a journal. The subject in the sentence is Felix, the verb is has started, and journal is the receiver of the action, because definitely journal cannot do the action of starting, okay? You might be asking why to write is not part of the verb. It's because to write is another part of a sentence. It's called an infinitive phrase, not a verb. Now, how do we transform or convert this sentence into passive voice? Again, the subject will be the receiver, so it will appear at the end of the sentence. And the receiver will be the subject of the sentence, so it will appear in front or at the beginning of the sentence. Just like here, a journal has been started to write by Felix. You have to take note of the change in the verb. It was has started here in the active voice, but it became has been started in passive voice. It's just the same, has, because it's singular. Felix is only one, journal is only one, so we use has. We just added been, okay, for passive voice. And started is just the same because started is the past participle already. Next, what if the given sentence is in passive voice? The shelves have been fixed by the students. The subject is shelves, the verb is have been fixed, and the doer is students. Now take a look at this example. The auxiliary verb used here is have, because the subject is shelves, and shelves is plural, it's more than one. Now how do we transform or convert it to active voice? The doer will become the subject, so the doer will appear in front of the sentence, and that's the subject. Then the subject here, which is shelves, will be transformed as the receiver in the active voice, and it will appear at the end of the sentence. Actually, the role is just the same. I mean, the function of the doer or the receiver is just the same. What only changes is whether it became a subject or not. What do I mean by that? Look at this. Students is the subject here. I mean, students is the doer of the action. Students is also the doer of the action here. But when we change the position, it was just the doer here, but it became the subject here. Okay? Now, let's look at the verb. In this part, the verb is have been fixed. We use been. That's what I mentioned earlier. If it's passive voice and perfect tense, there's always been. Okay? You have to always add been. Now, if it's going to be an active voice, you're going to remove been. Okay? That's the rule. If it's passive, you should always add been if it's perfect tense. But if it's active, you have to remove the word or the auxiliary verb been. Next, past perfect tense. I have here another example for active voice of the past perfect tense. Number 1, I had watched Squid Game in Netflix. It's past perfect. Had watched. The subject is I, the verb is had watched, and the receiver is Squid Game because Squid Game is not the one who did the action of watching. How do we transform it to passive voice? 1, Squid Game in Netflix had been watched by me. Okay, so the same thing, the receiver becomes the subject now. It's still the receiver actually, but it became the subject now in passive voice. And then the verb, from a simple had watched, it became had been watched. See, there's another been here because it's the perfect tense in passive voice. But if it's perfect tense in active voice, we don't use the auxiliary verb been. Okay, so the subject here, which is I, becomes the doer in this passive voice sentence. But it became me. Why? Because you can't use the pronoun I here. Let's try to read the sentence using the pronoun I instead of me. Squid Game in Netflix had been watched by me. Had been watched by I. That doesn't make sense. That's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because I is a pronoun used for subject, and me is a pronoun used for object. But I and me only refers to the same thing. Me, I, it's just the same. It's just that since the function of I here is subject, we use I. But the function here is object, so it's me. Okay, next. The example sentence is in passive voice. The old cabinet had been kept by my mom for years. The subject is old cabinet. The verb is had been kept. And the doer is my mom. So we're just going to change position. Okay, if it's going to be active, the subject will become the receiver, so it will appear at the end. The verb, using the auxiliary verb been, will be removed, so it will become had kept only. And then the doer, my mom, will become the subject because it's the active voice. Next, future perfect tense. This is the last one, don't worry. So, example sentence for active voice in future perfect tense. Number 1, the teacher will have checked the papers before she leaves. The subject is teacher, the verb is will have checked, and the receiver is papers. So if it's going to be passive voice, we're going to make a sentence like this. The papers will have been checked by the subject, by the teacher before she leaves. The subject is papers, the verb is will have been checked, and the doer is teacher. Teacher is also the doer here, but it's the subject. The verb is just will have and then the past participle check. But in passive voice, we added been because it's passive and because it's perfect tense. Next, the cats shall have been fed by Anna before she goes to work. The subject is cats. The verb is shall have been fed. And the doer is Anna because Anna is the one who will feed the cats. So we transfer the subject in the doer's position in active voice. So it's going to be Anna will appear in front because she is the subject, she is the doer. Anna shall have fed. Shall have fed, we remove the word been from passive. And then the cats, before she goes to work. The cats will appear after the verb. So there's a change in position. The cats appeared in front here in passive voice, but the cats appeared after the verb here in active voice. I hope that was somehow clear to you, especially in identifying the sentence, whether it's in active or passive voice. And of course, in converting sentences from active to passive and vice versa. If you are getting confused with anything, you can ask me a question via Messenger, and you can also look back at this video, okay? Now remember, you cannot convert a simple tense into a perfect tense and vice versa. You cannot change the tenses of the verb. It has to be parallel. Likewise, you cannot convert a present tense into past tense or future tense. Again, they have to be aligned and parallel. Present to present, past to past, future to future. And if a verb is in present tense, it must be in present tense also when converting from active to passive and vice versa. Same rule goes to past tense, future tense, and the perfect tenses. Thank you so much everybody, and I hope you learned something from this video lesson. Again everyone, keep on doing great!